All right. Without any further ado, Dr. Paul, are you there?
I'm not a doctor. Don't accuse me of that.
I'm sorry.
I got a high school diploma.
I'm sorry. I just want to kind of, I don't know, elevate you a little bit because we've relied so much on your research in the past. For those who aren't aware, there's a really good paper that we've referenced a gazillion times that Gregory Paul wrote, basically comparing societal health to religiosity and showing a negative correlation between the two. And we've pointed it out many, many times and used it for a number of things, not just explaining the meat of the actual study, but the difference between correlation and causation and making sure that people's arguments are clear. I had the good fortune to actually meet Greg when I was up at UMBC for a debate last October, I think it was. And he's called in once before, but today you want to call in and enlighten us a little on a new paper. So why don't you give us kind of a heads up on that?
Yeah, this paper actually is dates from about the same time I did the evolutionary psychology paper a couple of years ago. It isn't that new. But, you know, about not being a doctor, one of the cool things about me is I don't have a doctorate and I'm doing this advanced research. And I sent this paper out to the leading theologians, you know, asking for comment, and nobody's replied to it because they can't come up with a good one. And also the previous caller, that actually set us up fairly well from what we're talking about.
Cool.
The basic thing is that, and by the way, I think that science can tell us a lot about things that people haven't really looked at, too, including issues of morality. And what the previous caller was doing was making a major mistake. And atheists do this, too. And the basic mistake is the argument is often about, does God exist or not? And I don't think that can be entirely answered. You can't entirely disprove that ghosts are haunting the house on the corner. But you can probably show it's not true. But likewise, I don't think you can entirely disprove the existence of a God or multiple gods. What you can do is test the morality of any god. And what can be done, and what I did in this paper, it's in Philosophy and Theology. You can access the text at my website, which is www.gspscienceofreligion.com. Is I've shown there's no way that a benign, loving Christian deity can exist. And I've done that by looking at the most tragic thing that's happened that people have really not been paying attention to, what I call the holocaust of the children.
Okay. You know, I managed to get through a good chunk of the paper, and I don't know how many people are actually familiar with. I had a really interesting conversation, and let me see if this sets you up at all, where we had invited a minister on the show. Russell had him on, ostensibly to talk about the problem of evil, otherwise known as theodicy. But when he was on here, he absolutely refused to address the problem of evil at all and spent a lot of time talking about how cool he was and what nice things he was doing. It was as if he didn't understand the problem of evil at all. And in an email a few weeks ago, somebody, another Christian, wrote in to say that they thought he did a wonderful job of addressing the problem of evil. And as I tried to get them to explain exactly how he addressed the problem of evil at all, this individual's understanding was that the problem of evil was nothing more than evil exists in the world and Christianity doesn't have a good enough explanation for that, and thought that atheism had some dog in that fight as well, that we don't have a good explanation for why there's evil, which is not only false, but it steps outside the bounds of this. So if you want, I figure you can go through a little bit of the research you did and some of the numbers that I think are incredibly eye-opening.
Yeah, and it's kind of scary how people don't know some basic items, statistical items, and everybody should know. One of which, off the top, is how many people have been born so far. And a lot of people, I've heard, even William Dembski, who's supposed to be a great mathematician, the intelligent designer, said 10 billion people born so far. It's the number of people born in the 20th century alone. There's a guy named Carl Haub who did a classic study on population today. It's about 100 billion people so far. It's a huge number.
Wow. I'm surprised even.
No, there were like 300 million people alive during the Roman Empire. They lasted 20 years. The turnover rate was tremendous. So that century alone, 1 billion people. Just adds up over the last 10,000 years since agriculture came in. So it's about 100 billion. Now, there's another frightening number that people haven't looked at. And I'm actually the first person to do this really simple calculation. I don't know why I'm the first person to do it. But it's how many people who've been born have died as kids?
Yeah.
And that's not hard to figure out. The British did demographic work in India in the late 1800s and the European studies too. Historically, the death rate of kids has been 50%.
Wow.
50%.
Yeah, it's shocking.
So we're talking 50 billion dead kids so far. And that's the dead children after born. Pre-birth mortality rates may be up to 3/4 historically because the human reproductive system is so crappy. And you're talking then about the preborn who've died, or at least 100 billion, maybe 300 billion. Huge numbers.
Yeah.
Now, the scale of this is immense, and it's being ignored. And the implications are all over the map, not only for whether there's a good God or not, but it has crazy implications for who's in heaven and not, and so on. But anyway, the main thing about the children who've died is that most of them have died from diseases.
Sure.
And I want to stand back and just take a look at this a second. What's the basic premise of Christianity? There's one God, and also Islam, Christianity and Islam. There's one God who created the entire universe, this huge, vast thing. Well, where did this God stick us on? This tiny little speck of dust that's a death trap, loaded with so many diseases that it has killed off 50 billion children. And that's
but isn't the universe made to support life?
Pardon?
Isn't the universe made to support life?
This is we're not going to have time to go into this today, but this really challenges some basic things about, this concept that the universe is primed for life. It was just a little bit different, there wouldn't be life in it. Well, almost all the universe is deadly to life. You can't breathe in a vacuum. But the Earth itself, the one place, is a kid killer.
Yeah.
So, and for example, malaria alone has probably killed about 20 billion kids.
Mm-hmm. It's a pretty awful disease. It's been with us a long time, too.
Yeah, well, it's a terrible tragedy. So this is the worst thing that's happened. And people tend to focus, like when there's the tsunamis hit Japan or the Indonesian one, people start talking about, is there a good God, or there's the Jewish Holocaust. But these are pedantic things. This is the really big thing. And I went through the Theodist literature, all of it, Polkinghorne, Hott, Hicks, and they don't breathe a word about this. They have sub-chapters about suffering of animals. They do not mention the problem of the children, and I'm going to tell you why. The basic argument for theodicy these days is the reason that bad things happen is God doesn't want to control everything. God wants us all to make a free will choice whether to be with Him in heaven or not.
Right.
Plus, we need to perfect ourselves before we get there. And that's something a lot of Christians don't really understand, is that there cannot be anything imperfect in heaven ever. It's perfect. Once you're in there, you're going to be perfect forever. You have to be ready for that. So you have to have try and prepare and become an adult, become mature enough to make this decision. And I've mentioned the 50 billion figure to people, and they start bringing this up, and I say, well, wait a second. What age do you have to have free will? You got to get at least in your teens somewhere, something like that, or 20s.
Well, there's this age of reason concept, right?
Yeah.
Usually around 8 or so is what I've heard.
Well, that's kind of ridiculous to me, but still, whatever it is, half the people born basically die before they get to that age.
Yeah.
God doesn't give a damn about free will for humans. This is a completely bogus argument. Theodicy is wrecked. There is nothing to it. It is completely empty, and it's stupid.
Yeah, every one of the responses that I've ever heard to the problem of evil they seem, I can freely admit as somebody who is a Christian for 25 plus years, they are like anything else within the theology. They are convincing to those who already believe, and they are utterly vapid when anybody looks beyond that. And so when we talk about, there's been a number of proposed solutions to the problem of evil, the free will one being probably the most popular, and especially in the modern era. But other issues where they simply just blamed humans, all the diseases and things are our fault from the fall, which sets up another argument about the immorality of a God who designs a system like this. But what I like about what you've done here is that, okay, so if your go-to argument is now going to be free will, can you please reconcile that with the idea?
It's impossible. It can't be done. Yeah. This is why I think I have heard nothing about this. I've gotten a fair amount of response about my sociological work and that sort of thing, but this is being ignored. It's such a deep problem.
Yeah, there's a number of things we've talked about over the years, especially like when we've had Vic Stinger and stuff on here, who I think does a really good job of kind of going through the possible gods and basically destroying any possibility that they exist. And you know, like with the first caller, when I was explaining that if you don't have an answer, that doesn't mean that you're justified in positing this. But for people who already believe, they have in their head some sort of model of the way the universe is and how a God relates to that. And in every case, when you drill down to the specifics of what they believe and compare them to the observations of the universe, it crumbles. And when we're talking about the case that you're raising particularly, where half of the people who have ever lived have died before they reach any sort of, you know, age of reason or responsibility, well, okay, that destroys the free will response. So exactly what could you possibly be left with? We've talked before about the fact that this God, in every incarnation, especially with Christianity, is a little like a Wile E. Coyote was Tracy Harris's example, where he goes through all these elaborate measures, you know, in creating this vast universe in order to put people on there when they're purportedly his special creation. And then even when you get down to that, the universe still doesn't work in a way that makes any kind of sense. So is their God just incompetent or inept? I mean, certainly there's no sort of perfection in that.
Well, you know, we humans, as primitive as we are, we've brought childhood mortality rates down to a few percent. We can do it. So this idea that there's a God that's incompetent, the incompetence would be unbelievable. It's not an acceptable argument.
Yeah.
So even that doesn't work. What I'm thinking we should start doing is really emphasizing this, and I think it should become common knowledge among atheists that there are 50 billion dead children so far. I mean, most still don't know this, that there have been probably a couple 100 billion or more preborn who died, and really start throwing this at them and at theists, and do it in a very strong way. I'm starting to challenge Christians directly, saying when they start talking about their God and their loving God, I say you're worshiping. Well, I wish I was on Real Time with Bill Maher when Ann Coulter was on.
Yeah.
Did you see that? When she arched her back up and said, "I believe in God," nobody on that panel knew what to say. I would have crushed her right there. I would have said, "You're kissing the ass of a God who slaughtered 50 billion children so far for your own self-aggrandizement to get into heaven for eternity. This is completely base and morally degraded. How could you be so sick and twisted?" And we need to start doing this to Christians. I'm not one of those people who believes in being polite to Christians. I mean, you know, you don't want to be rude in terms of saying nasty things to them egregiously, but confront them directly. And I'm starting to do this, and they get the deer in the headlights look.
Yeah, because you're confronting an issue. You're not necessarily confronting them. The hope is, of course, that they'll eventually see. I've used the mafia boss analogy before, which I think aptly fits the God of the Bible in almost any form you want to put him into. But in this case, when we're talking about this, I mean, this is a useful challenge for a lot of things. Maybe August 6th, when Governor Perry is down there having his prayer rally along with the American Family Association hate group, it might be worthwhile to ask them, you know, among the problems that he thinks he's incompetent to solve and needs to appeal to Jesus for, is he thinking about doing anything for the 50 billion who have died?
How do we do that? I mean, I'd like to know. I mean, it's an interesting thing to do.
I don't know, because I can't get him to answer questions when I'm standing next to him on the walkway of the Capitol. He just kind of runs away from me, and I've invited him on the show. So I'm planning on possibly going out there and standing out alongside, ironically, the Westboro Baptist Church, who are also protesting his event, which I think just makes this even funnier.
Get some signs. Get signs literally and put 50 billion children on it so far. I'm not kidding. Why don't we start doing that?
Yeah.
And there's a kind of an irony here, because coming from the background and knowing so many Christians, I can easily throw the hat back on and say that the most common response I would expect to this, after you get them to the point where they can't come up with anything, they can no longer defend it without sacrificing their own integrity, is they'll do something that still sacrifices their integrity but hides it, and that is that they will just trust that God has taken care of those 50 billion in his wisdom, and that they have been spirited off to heaven.
This is the cool thing. Now, think about this. I mean, there are different alternatives for what happened to the souls of children. And also, I'm starting to ask that. What happens to the souls of little children when they die? And in strict Christian doctrine, they go to hell because they didn't accept the grace of Christ.
That's right. They're born with original sin, and
they're imperfect. You have to be perfect when you get to heaven. So they're being sent to hell. But very few Christians believe that. And of course, the Catholic Church tried to get around this for a while with limbo.